Class. So for today's assignment, I'm going to be doing my presentation on perception and culture. So let's begin. So what is perception? What is sight and perception? And how do we perceive the worlds we live in? And how do we perceive different people from different cultures or even different states? So these are all areas I want to address and attack in this discussion. So first, let's begin with sight and perception. So the difference between sight and perception, I would say, in my own opinion, is perception is the internalization of what you see and internalizing that and assuming that is the actual judgment or interpreting it as it is. So for instance, I could be seeing a gentleman with a very red face and a very tight facial expression. And my perception of that might be, well, the fact being that his face is so red and it looks like from his facial expressions that he's angry, he's most likely probably angry. And that's perception. It's basically when we interpret something from sight. And I'm beginning to notice that we do this a lot in different areas, different cultures, different parts of the world that we live in, and even different states as well, and how we perceive them, and how we perceive ourselves even. A perfect example of this is I noticed in Michigan here, we have a lot of people that come from different areas during the summertime. And usually there's a few things that our locals will say when they notice someone that isn't from the area. They will usually say, well, that person is from Chicago or Detroit or Ohio because they act like this, or because they drive like this. I think a perfect example of it was recently I was at work recently, and I went to go to lunch, and I'm sitting in the grocery store line, and there's this gentleman in front of us, and he's taking forever actually at the line. And the guy next to me he says, "Oh, he's probably from Chicago." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, why do you think that?" And he said, "Oh, because of how he conducts himself. He holds himself like he owns the town." And for me, I was sitting back and I was like, wow, so you're perceiving that he's from another area based on how he holds himself? So I think we perceive different people from different areas based on what we would categorize as stereotyping or labeling. Now, what does perception have to do with the social media? I want to kind of address this issue right here. And I think a lot of this has to do with my generation most importantly, but the upcoming generations on how they view people and how they view even businesses from social media. And I realize we live in a world where social media plays a huge role on perception. Usually when you talk to someone, you said, hey, did you check out their Facebook page? Usually before you've even met them, or if you're looking to meet someone, you first go on to their social media page. You don't immediately ask people that know them. You seem to go straight to Facebook or straight to Instagram or Twitter to get your perception of what you think they are based on their profile. And we even do so with websites too, whether it's going to the next taco shop or going to apply for a job. We look at a company's website and base off our perception of how good the website is or how good their social media is. And I found it interesting because Sebets did this in her case study on if social media had anything to do with perception of people, and she compared and contrast between either meeting someone on social media and meeting someone in person. And she said the findings suggest there's more consistency between first impressions formed in response to observations made in the real world and impressions based on information found in web pages, meaning that they're both pretty consistent, and that social media has a pretty high ground to stand on when it comes to making first impressions of people and forming perceptions of someone. So that then brings me to perception and culture. How we perceive the cultures apart from social media, and how we as cultures tend to be very one-sided. I enjoyed this because Mr. Brule said it in his TED Talk that we have glasses on how we perceive people culturally. He used this example as if if you're from America, we have a certain glasses and how we expect people from other countries to act to fit our cultural standards. And each culture does this, and we all seem to forget to remove our own lenses. And I began to think about that in my life and say, how many times have I done that? When I've met someone either from a different state or I've met someone from a different country and they are just culturally acting how they would act to someone, say, from like Switzerland or where they're from, and I'm acting how I would act with someone from America, but internally I'm going, this guy is weird, or this dude's a little up close and personal. And that brings me to my own personal experience, and that was in the summer of 2016. I was able to go to Denver, Colorado for a men's conference. And there was men from all over the world there. And I actually got to meet a man from Italy. And I began to sit back and think about this now and how my culture was different from his culture. And in the conversation I had with him, he was a very open gentleman, both physically and emotionally. He would actually talk to me as if he was sitting and standing right in front of my face. And for me, that really scared me. That I felt like he was being a little too pushy, and I, looking back now, realized that I appeared to have a very closed off and very self-focused way of communicating. As for this gentleman, was very other-centered. He talked a lot about his family. He seemed to ask me a lot of questions and seemed to genuinely care about my response other than myself, to where I would ask him a question and expect him to ask me a question to where I could respond to him. As for he was very other-centeredness and very open, not just with emotions, but physically. Like I said, like he would hug me after I would have a conversation with him and I left to go to the restroom. Another example was he actually like cried in front of me. And it wasn't like he shared a super deep experience that happened in his life, but he was so emotional about just coming to this conference and how his culture acts as they're very emotional people. He just started crying out of emotion, out of happiness. And for me, I was very uncomfortable with this at first. I began to see things through my American lens of a very egotistical and self-centered approach, compared to thinking of him as he's acting this way because of his culture. And I honestly viewed them as very sensitive people. I kind of viewed them as too close and too open. Like, why would you open up to me about all these things? And why would you be so sensitive to cry over something that maybe doesn't seem that important to me, or doesn't seem that big of a deal? And now looking back, I've realized that's changed a lot. Whenever I meet people now, after thinking and looking at that experience from him, I'm beginning to notice a change, just in how I approach people, not just my fellow Americans and other people from the United States, but also I'm noticing how I interact with people outside of that. I'm starting to focus less on my bias and being aware of it, but also being open to their own cultural perceptions and their own cultural laws that they have and how they treat people. Recently, I thought it was interesting because I sat down with someone who was a missionary, and she was a U.S. missionary in Prague, and she told me this. She said, in Prague, they are very culturally closed off. As for us Americans, in America, we would sit next to someone and try to have a conversation with a random person. But in Prague, they won't do that. They are very self-centered as well, but very closed off more so. And I thought that was interesting. So, with that being said, I viewed Italians to be different. I saw their view and related with them based off of my cultural lens. And because of that, I wasn't aware of my own bias. And now, after doing the research and understanding, I've come to an understanding that perception is key. And that if we become aware of perception, we can become aware of how we relate to people, how we interact with other people from different states, different countries, and different ethnic backgrounds, most importantly. And hopefully, we can form relationships with them if we take off those glasses and understand where they're coming from.